Modern sourdough is a 12 to 24-hour commitment. You feed the starter on schedule, you babysit the bulk fermentation, you pray the dough does not stall, and half the time it stalls anyway. Your kitchen turns into a science experiment with no guaranteed results. The sourdough revival told you slow bread is better bread. That part is true, but it left out a critical step that traditional bakers never skipped. Bakers in West Africa, China, the Americas, and pre-industrial Europe all added one ingredient to their dough that modern recipes have completely erased. It was not a fancy flour. It was not a secret yeast strain. It was a powder that came from their fireplace. And the reason they added it is a piece of chemistry that changes everything you think you know about how bread rises. The problem did not start with your sourdough starter. It started in 1961 in a government laboratory in Chorleywood, England. That is where British food scientists invented the Chorleywood bread process, a method that could turn flour into a finished loaf in under 3.5 hours. No long fermentation, no sourdough culture, just high-speed mechanical mixing, chemical oxidizers, extra yeast, and a cocktail of additives that forced the dough to rise in a fraction of the natural time. Within decades, over 80% of all bread sold in the United Kingdom was made using the Chorleywood process. The United States followed its own version of the same playbook. Factory bread today ferments for as little as 45 minutes. The result is a loaf that looks like bread, smells vaguely like bread, and technically qualifies as bread under food labelling law. But it behaves nothing like the bread your body evolved to digest. Here is why that matters. During natural sourdough fermentation, lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid that slowly dismantles phytic acid, the compound inside every grain of wheat that locks up iron, zinc, and magnesium so your gut cannot absorb them. A 2024 study published in the journal Foods confirmed that traditional sourdough fermentation reduces phytic acid by up to 62%, compared to just 38% with commercial yeast. That is the difference between a food that feeds you and a food that starves you while you chew it. So the sourdough revival is a good thing. People are going back to slow fermentation, wild cultures, long rises. But here is what nobody in the modern sourdough community talks about. The process is still incomplete. Modern sourdough bakers have recovered one half of the traditional system, the biological fermentation. They have completely ignored the other half, the mineral chemistry that made traditional bread rise faster, develop more complex flavor, and deliver more bioavailable nutrients than sourdough alone can produce. And that mineral chemistry starts with a substance that has been hiding in plain sight for the entire history of baking. When food historians find references to wood ash in old bread recipes, they assume one of three things: contamination from wood-fired ovens, evidence of poverty, bakers too poor to afford proper ingredients, or simple ignorance, people who did not know any better. This interpretation has survived in academic literature for over a century, and it is completely wrong. In West Africa, potash, called kaun, is not a mistake. It is a staple ingredient. Cooks produce it by burning hardwood or plantain peels, collecting the ash, soaking it in water, and filtering the liquid to extract a concentrated alkaline salt. That salt is potassium carbonate, the exact same compound an orphan named Amelia Simmons printed in the first cookbook written by an American, published in Hartford, Connecticut in 1796. West African cooks add it deliberately to soups, to fermented locust beans, and to dough. This practice is documented across more than 160 ethnic groups in East Africa alone. It is not contamination. It is the foundation of an entire culinary tradition. In China and Japan, the same compound goes by a different name, kansui. It is the single ingredient that defines ramen noodles. Without kansui, a wheat noodle is not ramen. Chinese noodle makers have been harvesting alkaline mineral crystals from lake shores and dissolving them into their dough for over 1,000 years. The potassium carbonate changes the protein structure, creates elasticity, develops flavor compounds that cannot form without an alkaline environment, and turns the noodles yellow. This is precision chemistry performed by hand for centuries before anyone wrote a periodic table. And in the Americas, indigenous communities understood the same principle applied to corn. They soaked corn kernels in water mixed with wood ash, a process we now call nixtamalization. The alkaline treatment breaks down the tough outer hull, releases bound niacin that the body cannot otherwise access, and destroys anti-nutritional factors that block mineral absorption. Without this step, populations that depend on corn develop pellagra, a devastating niacin deficiency disease that causes skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and death. European colonizers who adopted corn but skipped the ash treatment paid for that ignorance with epidemics of pellagra that killed tens of thousands across the American South and Southern Europe well into the 20th century. 4 continents, thousands of years, the same compound, the same chemistry, the same results, and food historians called it contamination. So the real question is, what exactly does potassium carbonate do inside sourdough dough? And why does it make the rise so much faster? Let's walk through the chemistry. Your sourdough starter is a living ecosystem. Wild yeast, primarily Saccharomyces cerevisiae and related species, consumes the sugars in flour and produces carbon dioxide gas. That gas gets trapped in the gluten network and makes the dough rise. That is the part you already know. Alongside the yeast, lactobacillus bacteria produce lactic acid. That acid gives sourdough its tang and breaks down phytic acid. The yeast and the bacteria work together in a symbiotic relationship that has been the foundation of bread for thousands of years. But these two organisms have a problem. As the lactobacillus bacteria do their job, the pH of the dough drops. Fresh dough starts around pH 5.5 to 6.0. Over hours of fermentation, the acid accumulates. The yeast performs best in a slightly acidic range. pH 4.0 to 5.5 is optimal. But once the pH drops below 3.8, the system destabilizes. The bacteria stop replicating. The yeast, stressed by the rising acidity, slows its gas production. The rise stalls. This is the moment every sourdough baker dreads, the dough that just stops moving because the acid has pushed the entire ecosystem past its operating limit. Now add a small amount of potassium carbonate to that dough. 3 things happen simultaneously. First, the alkaline compound reacts directly with the lactic acid, a straightforward acid-base reaction that produces carbon dioxide gas on contact. You get an immediate burst of lift that is purely chemical, not biological. This is the same reaction that makes baking powder work. The difference is that traditional bakers were triggering it with wood ash, and the acid their own sourdough culture had already produced. Second, and this is the more important effect, the potassium carbonate neutralizes excess acid, pulling the pH back up into the optimal range for yeast activity. The yeast that had stalled suddenly wakes up. Gas production resumes at full speed. A researcher on the Fresh Loaf, one of the largest sourdough baking forums in the world, documented this mechanism precisely. If you buffer the dough so that the pH stays above 3.8 for even one additional doubling cycle of the bacteria, you get twice as many organisms producing gas for the remainder of the fermentation. The effect compounds exponentially. Every additional cycle the yeast stays active means dramatically more carbon dioxide trapped in the dough. Third, wood ash is not pure potassium carbonate. It contains potassium, calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, the exact minerals that yeast and bacteria need to grow and reproduce. The 2024 review published in Foods confirmed that mineral availability directly impacts fermentation performance in sourdough systems. The minerals from wood ash are not just buffering the pH, they are feeding the organisms that drive the rise. You are simultaneously removing the brake and adding fuel. And there is a fourth effect that connects directly to human nutrition. The alkaline treatment from potassium carbonate breaks down phytic acid through a completely different mechanism than sourdough bacteria. Sourdough fermentation activates an enzyme called phytase, which works optimally in the acidic range of pH 3.5 to 4.5. The alkaline addition attacks phytic acid from the opposite direction. Direct chemical hydrolysis that cleaves the molecule apart regardless of enzyme activity. A 2022 study published in the Journal of Cereal Science confirmed that applying alkaline treatment to wheat bran in a nixtamalization style process reduced phytic acid content and improved calcium and iron bioavailability. Traditional bakers who added ash to their sourdough were running both mechanisms simultaneously. Enzymatic breakdown from the acid phase and chemical hydrolysis from the alkaline addition, without understanding either one. This is not primitive. This is a dual mechanism mineral extraction system operating inside a loaf of bread. So if this knowledge existed across 4 continents for thousands of years, what happened to it? The answer begins in Birmingham, England, in 1843. A chemist named Alfred Bird had a problem. His wife Elizabeth suffered from severe allergies to both eggs and yeast. She could not eat normal bread. Bird's solution was to combine sodium bicarbonate with cream of tartar, an alkaline base, and a dry acid that react on contact with liquid to produce carbon dioxide. He called the mixture baking powder. Bird's invention did the same thing wood ash had been doing in bread for centuries. An alkaline compound reacting with an acid to produce gas. The critical difference was that Bird's version was standardized, measured, shelf-stable, and packaged for sale. It was consistent. It was clean. It did not taste like fireplace. Within 50 years, baking powder had conquered the global market. It replaced pearl ash, it replaced kaun, it replaced kansui in baking applications, and it replaced the entire tradition of mineral-boosted bread in a single generation. And because baking powder was marketed as a modern scientific breakthrough, a clean replacement for primitive methods, the original practice of adding wood ash to dough was rewritten in the history books as contamination, poverty, or ignorance. But here is what was lost in that transition. Baking powder provides chemical leavening and nothing else. It does not buffer pH during fermentation. It does not feed yeast and bacteria with essential minerals. It does not trigger alkaline hydrolysis of phytic acid. It does not improve mineral bioavailability. It is a single-function product that replaced a multifunction system. And because modern bakers use baking powder in quick breads and sourdough starter in artisan loaves, never combining them, neither method delivers what the traditional approach delivered by default. Now you understand the mechanism, here is how to use it. The ingredient you need is food-grade potassium carbonate. You can buy it online from baking or brewing suppliers. It is the same compound sold as kansui powder for making ramen noodles. A 6-ounce bag costs roughly $5 to $8 and will last you months of baking. The amount matters. You are not replacing your sourdough starter. You are supplementing it. Add 1/4 teaspoon of potassium carbonate per pound of flour. Dissolve it in your water before mixing the dough. This small amount is enough to buffer the pH and trigger the acid-base reaction without overwhelming the sourdough culture. Here is what you will notice. The dough will feel slightly more elastic, the same gluten-strengthening effect that gives ramen noodles their characteristic chew. The initial rise will be noticeably faster. Where your usual bulk fermentation might take 8 to 12 hours at room temperature, expect to see active, vigorous rising within the first 2 to 3 hours. The crumb will be more open. The crust will brown more deeply and more evenly because alkaline conditions accelerate the Maillard reaction, the chemical process responsible for browning. And the flavor will not taste like ash. At this concentration, the potassium carbonate is completely undetectable. If you want to go fully traditional, you can make your own potash water from hardwood ash. Burn hardwood only. Oak, maple, hickory, ash, or beech all work well. Never use softwood like pine, which contains resins and harmful compounds. Never use treated, painted, or composite wood under any circumstances. Let the ash cool completely. Sift out any charcoal chunks. Place the fine white ash in a container. Add water at a ratio of roughly 1 part ash to 4 parts water by volume. Stir thoroughly and let it sit for several hours. Filter the liquid through a fine cloth or coffee filter. The resulting clear liquid is lye water, a dilute potassium carbonate solution. A word on safety. Concentrated lye water is caustic and will irritate skin and eyes on direct contact. Traditional bakers tested the strength of their solution by floating an egg. If the egg floated with a coin-sized patch above the surface, the concentration was right for baking. For your first attempts, buying food-grade potassium carbonate and measuring it precisely is the safer, more reliable approach. The traditional method works. The modern shortcut is just more forgiving of mistakes. Let's be honest about the trade-offs. Potassium carbonate accelerates the rise and improves mineral bioavailability, but if you add too much, you will raise the pH above the range where your sourdough culture can survive. High alkaline concentrations kill both yeast and lactobacillus. You are tuning the pH of a living system, not overriding it. Start with 1/4 teaspoon per pound of flour. If your bread tastes soapy or metallic, you have used too much. Scale back. The sweet spot is subtle. The traditional bakers who perfected this spent lifetimes calibrating it by feel. Give yourself a few loaves to dial it in. We did not invent chemical leavening in 1843. We did not discover the power of alkaline minerals in a laboratory. We standardized something that traditional bakers on 4 continents had been practicing for centuries, and in the process, we stripped away every benefit except the one that saved time. Baking powder gives you speed. Wood ash gave you speed, nutrition, pH stability, and mineral bioavailability all at once. The recipe is 1 ingredient. The amount is 1/4 teaspoon per pound of flour. The science is confirmed, and now you have it.